ACC Nation Football Preview with our special guest, Corey Crisan, who covers Pitt and the Steelers for DK Pittsburgh Sports. Thanks for joining us, Corey.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate the vine again. If you see the bags under my eyes, this is the look of a beat reporter who has spent the better part of 2 weeks on the fields of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, watching the Pittsburgh Steelers practice and get ready for their season. But we're here to talk about the college team that represents the city of Pittsburgh. Thanks again, guys. Really appreciate having me on.
Yeah, we enjoyed having you on last time and said, hey, we're going to have you back. And here it is. Pitt, under Pat Narduzzi, has been that scary shadow you think you see when walking down a dark alley. And just when you think it's all in your head, out they pop with a 2x4. The past few years, Narduzzi has been silently stalking the top tier of the ACC, and along the way has tossed in a run at the championship. The Panthers have 34 wins since 2019, Corey. This is not a team that we should be overlooking, and unfortunately it seems, and maybe because you're in an NFL town, that people tend to sort of overlook Pitt sometimes. And I know that's the case throughout some of the ACC as well, but people just sort of, oh, Pitt, and then they lose, and it's, oh, Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a little bit about this whole image thing. We started talking to it a little bit before we got into the program, but there's this thing that Pat has been working on, and it's starting to really become a thing. And I think the fans are starting to respond as well.
You have to start by looking at what Pat Narduzzi has done over the last 2 seasons. Obviously, having a Heisman contender in Kenny Pickett helps a lot. And having a quarterback and the stability at that position to build off of. Really, Kenny was there for 4.5, 5 years to do that and help get that program, so to speak, stable. You know, think of it the last 2 years. Pitt has finished each of the last 2 seasons with an AP top 25 ranking. They're one of, I believe it's 7 or 8 Division I college football programs that can say that. Pitt has also, that Sun Bowl win against UCLA was phenomenal. It was one of the best bowl games of the year, the calendar year last year. But, then you have NFL talent coming out. You have the Kalijah Canseys, the Servassier Dennises in this past draft, and Carter Warren and Israel Banakanda. Kalijah Cansey being the first rounder, and then when you look at Kenny Pickett from last year's draft, that's 2 first-rounders in a row. They're putting out defensive linemen, defensive backs, offensive linemen. They're putting out product into the NFL. And at this point, it's hard to ignore. Now, there's a perception around Pitt, as you mentioned, as it being a tier below the Clemson and the Florida State and maybe even now the North Carolina, at least when it comes to the ACC, and the Miami when you look at the recruiting. But results are results at the end of the day.
Yes.
And what Pat Narduzzi has done in his now 8 seasons at Pitt is he has taken this program, he has made it his own. We talked about this before we fired up the recording. If you could personify one human being to be the head football coach at the University of Pittsburgh, you look at Pat Narduzzi as that tough leader, the guy that's not going to take crap, that's going to punch you right back, that's going to fight for his players, that's going to recruit and develop for a city and a system. When you look at a Pitt football coach and that stereotype and you're in the lab creating that character, Pat Narduzzi is that character. And the way that he carries this program with great assistant coaches around him, 100% staff retention, save for, a GA or 2, that always happens. But when you have Charlie Partridge putting out defensive linemen consistently in the league, and Dave Borbley and his experience in developing offensive linemen, and now you look at Ryan Manilak, an up-and-comer at linebackers coach, Narduzzi has the right people in place. He has the right system in place. He recruits players specifically for that system. And now the proof is actually in the pudding. There are 20 wins over the last 2 seasons. Not a lot of football programs can say that either. So I think right now what Pitt is doing, and we can talk about the 2023 outlook all we want, but the results have been there, at least over the last you could go back to maybe even 2018 when, you get the Damar Hamlins of the world, you get the Jordan Whiteheads of the world, you get all these players that you're now seeing in the NFL as cornerstone franchise pieces in the NFL, and you see when those guys started to develop.
So Narduzzi is, in fact, that shadow in the alley, and he's got the 2x4. And it's one of the things that I know about Pennsylvania, and especially when it comes to football, that blue collar work ethic, grinded out football thing. That's been going on in Pennsylvania for as long as I've been alive, and longer. And it feels like you talk about Pat Narduzzi personifying, what a coach ought to be at Pitt. I feel like he's sort of taking that and bringing that to some sort of a reality, and people connect with that. The fans, and I ask you again, the fans, they buying into this, what Narduzzi is selling?
I think when you can look at pre-ACC championship appearance and ACC championship victory, it was a jury out situation for, is this working or is it not? But after Pat brings in a Kenny Pickett, he develops a Kenny Pickett from a 3-star recruit. They win the ACC championship, and then they follow it up. And this is the key point, I think. They follow it up with 8 wins. You could have argued there were a couple of games last year that they should have won too. You look at that Louisville game, like they should have entered that game and won that game, but they obviously didn't. So you're an 8-win team. You go into a bowl game, a good bowl game. When you look at the non-New Year's Six, the non-college football playoff, like the Sun Bowl is a really good representation bowl game. You beat a top 25 in that game. Okay, you do it with Nick Patty and what he was able to do, but he comes into that game, as a fill-in. And that's what he was perceived to be all season, as the backup. We hear this story about Keaton Slovis coming from Southern California. Keaton Slovis is going to be the next Kenny Pickett. He's going to be able to fill the shoes. He's going to be able to do this and that. Dark horse Heisman. And then it was a giant flop. And now he's at BYU. So you bring in Phil Jurkovec for 2023. You see what you can do in developing an offense. And like the fact that Pat was able to follow up 2021 in an ACC championship with 2022, and they were able to find a way to stack those two together, not like have that championship and then go 6-6 and then go 9-4 again. Like they were able to stack that up. I think that was incredibly imperative for Pat.
So let's break down the offense a little bit. You mentioned Jurkovec coming over from Boston College, but we got to be real. He's had his injury issues the last couple of seasons. Is this staff confident in him staying healthy for a whole season?
They better be. And that's not to say that what they have behind Phil is not good. They have good talent behind Phil with Christian Veilleux coming over from Penn State. With Nate Yarnell, we saw what he was able to do in a couple of flashes last season. Like there's good depth at quarterback, but when you look at the loss of a Jared Wayne, a 1,000-yard receiver, the loss of Israel Abanikanda, the ACC leading rusher, Carter Warren being a pro football left tackle, being hurt last year, and then you have a couple of guys fill in. Like you would have to think that, logically speaking, if Pitt was going to finish with 8 wins in the regular season last year with next to no quarterback play, solid quarterback play at least, then what could they do with average quarterback play in 2023, given Kanate Mumfield, Bum Means are back at wide receiver, given Dejon Reynolds transfers in from Florida, who has a lot of potential, at least physically. I mean, goodness, he's so gifted. And then you look at Phil and the potential of what he could have been at Boston College and could have been at Notre Dame, and we just haven't seen him put it together quite yet. Now, he wasn't bad under Frank Signetti at Boston College when they had their brief time there, but he wasn't outstanding, or maybe what we thought he could have been coming out of high school. Again, he's a Pittsburgh kid, Pine Richland High School. So me personally, let me go back to my own take on Phil. I am more cautious and I am more skeptical on how Jurkovec could carry this offense this season than most are, based on track record. I need to see it before I believe it. that's kind of my motto with this Pitt offense in a general scope. I need to see it first before I could say this is what the offense is, because I truly don't know. Jurkovec's a new quarterback. Rodney Hammond, he was banged up a little bit last year, but he looked good running behind Izzy. Then you have Konate Mumfield and Bub Means, who are expected to take a step, but they were inconsistent across the span of 12, 13 games last season. Gavin Bartholomew, who last year a lot of people thought was going to be like the breakout offensive player of the ACC, didn't really get the ball much. So what is Frank Cignetti going to do in year 2 as Pitt's offensive coordinator? How is he going to maybe go back and dial up some of this stuff that he did with Phil Jurkovec at Boston College, translate it, adjust it, whatever he needs to do to make it work here at Pitt with the personnel that he has?
You mentioned Hammond. He's probably going to be RB1 heading into the fall, but you mentioned he's banged up a little bit. And is he someone that's ready to take more of a share of the carries this year? Or are they going to use more of a two-back system?
I think it's going to be a lot more Rodney Hammond than Rodney Hammond plus Sibo Flemister or Derek Davis, the transfer from LSU. I think Rodney has unbelievable potential, even for his size. Some might look at the measuring tape and say, well, he's a little undersized. I don't think so. That kid has strength, and it's sneaky good strength. Whereas last year, when you look at with Izzy as a speed back, home run hitter, those two were a perfect complement to each other. Now there's a little bit of adjustment because Rodney Hammond, while he's still got decent speed, he's just not as fast as Izzy was. There's going to be a lot more hard-hitting runs. There's going to be a lot more short yardage runs. There's going to be a lot more Rodney Hammond having to kind of find a way to break through holes, whereas Izzy just had that vision and had that home run hitting capability and was able to break right away. So there might be a little bit of development going into this run game, but what Pitt has to help Rodney is a really good offensive line. For my money, it's one of the top 3 in the ACC. When you look at Matt Gonsalves preseason All-ACC, when you look at Jake Cradle, an experienced veteran at center, Blake Zabovic, a veteran guard, Ryan Jacoby, who's been around and has a lot of potential at guard. They have options for left tackle like Ryan Baer, former top recruit. Branson Taylor's probably going to start at left. Like, this offensive line, I think, is going to be the strength of the offense, whether it becomes a pass heavy or a run heavy or a balanced system. And if Rodney Hammond's going to have the success and Sibo Flemister is going to get his and Derek Davis is going to get his, then I think it's going to start with that offensive line, how much they're able to really build off of a strong rushing campaign from last year.
Mentioned over a receiver, you talked about the guys who are coming back, who are still relatively young in their careers, but is this a spot where depth is kind of a concern going into the fall?
That's my biggest point of skepticism right now on this roster is the wide receivers room. I like the frame that Dejon Reynolds has. I like the speed that Bub Means brings. I like kind of the blend of both that Konate Mumfield has. But I'm not sure who's going to be the lead dog, so to speak, to step up behind them. I think it might be Jake McConaughey. I think it could be one of the few freshmen that they have coming in. But that's my biggest point of skepticism within this offense. And quite frankly, probably within this team is the depth at wide receiver. Gavin Bartholomew has a lot of potential as a tight end, and they could use him in a lot of different situations. So we'll see how it develops. I'm not sure how many 3-wide, 4-wide empty sets we're going to see from Pitt, at least early on. I think they're going to stick to those core 3 and then go from there and let Phil kind of branch off from there. But I'm going to hold off on analyzing this Pitt wide receivers room until, mid-season or however long it needs to take, because I just don't know, given Dejon Reynolds didn't play much at Florida and Konate Mumfield and Bub Means were largely inconsistent last year.
Taking everything that you're saying, Corey, and putting it together, I still want to go back to this line for just a second and talk a little bit. That is an important part, and I'm always one to be right there talking about how important the line is, because the rest of it is not going to function if that line is not working. It goes that way on offense and defense. So let me get a little deeper in here. Sounds to me like you've got a pretty experienced and maybe deep line, which is critical. but you were throwing out two different things here and this is the reason I'm coming back to it, is that I wasn't sure whether you felt like it was going to be more effective with the run or providing Jurkovec the time to start connecting with some of these wide receivers. Which of those two do you see them to be the most effective at when it's, it's out on the field and it's time to go?
I'm very glad you brought it up and you worded it that way, because I think this line is built as a run blocking unit first. I think the strength of this unit is how they're going to be able to road grade, so to speak, for the Rodney Hammonds of the world. And that's going to be able to open up the opportunities for Phil Jurkovec. When I look at the makeup of last year's Pitt offensive line with a Carter Warren, who was a really good pass blocker at left tackle, then you have a really good run blocker in Marcus Minor up the middle, who was starting and playing in every snap basically last year. Jake Cradle's known more of a run blocker. Zubovic known more as a run blocker. So, when you look at how Pitt has built this offense over the last few years in recruiting, yes, there was a guy named Kenny Pickett to build an offense around, but they also had a pretty decent running game in those years. And then last year, you saw what Izzy Abanikanda was able to do and break out and win the ACC rushing title. This offense is built to run first. And I have a feeling that it's going to be leaning again towards running first. And I think this offensive line has the strength, and I think its strength is run blocking before pass blocking. And that's not to say that, Phil Jurkovec's going to have a dirty jersey in every game. But, when I look at the identity of what Pat Narduzzi and offensive line coach Dave Borbley have built for this room, I see a lot of really good run blockers, and I see pass blockers that might not be as polished as you would want for an offense in the ACC, but at the same time, they're able to do just enough. Because of the support that run game brings, they're able to do just enough to keep the quarterback clean, to allow for some big plays to happen. And you saw it in some moments last year with guys on this very line right now with Cradle, Zubovic, Gonsalves, and Branson Taylor. So experience is a huge thing. They feel really good about the depth. They just added Dorian Ford to that room. Ryan Baer, I mentioned, as a former top recruit. They have a lot of players that have been in that system for, by this point, 2 and 3 years. So they feel good about the veterans and the depth from the veterans that are in that room.
So you guys smack me down if I'm stepping out of line here.
Okay.
Jurkovec is not somebody that I see, doing an end around, but the dude is pretty big. And when he has a decent line in front of him, he can move the ball up the middle on a designed run. So this puts him, I think, in a position, based upon what you're telling me about this line, puts him in a position to start moving the ball on some designed quarterback runs.
I wouldn't see that as impossible. He's not going to be like, the Drake May or Caleb Williams, right. But every here and then you might be able to see him get out of the pocket and might be able to see him pick up a few yards, whether it's on a scramble or a design. Now, given the depth and how much they like this running back room, I don't know how often we're going to actually see that, but that is something that defenses definitely have to account for.
So, Corey, it was really nice of you not to smack me down on that.
I wasn't going to do that. I'm a guest. I can't be doing that.
It happens.
I'll allow it.
Trust me. You've been given permission, and it's all over with now. It's all going downhill. Let's jump over into defense here for just a few moments, because we got a lot to talk about here. They lost a lot of critical pieces. Let's just be blunt, okay? Mm-hmm. But there's also depth that is stepping up. Now the question is, like with any team, is, do you have the type of depth that has experience, 1 or 2 years in a program, and the ability to really make a dent in the position that you're filling. So on defense, in an overall picture, since there's so many critical pieces that just, have moved on, mm-hmm. what's your feel for this, this aspect of Pitt this year? Is this going to be a strong thing? Is, as Pat and his crew been able to fill those pieces and bring something together?
To answer this in a better context, I would look to the Sun Bowl and how Pitt had to navigate around more than a dozen. I don't remember the exact number, close to a dozen and a half players that either sat out or were hurt or whatever reason. That includes Elijah Cansey and Servassier Dennis and many of those pieces, like a Brandon Hill, that were huge contributors to the defense and that, quite frankly, were the major playmakers. Now, I could go to whichever position level specifically, but in a general scope, when you look at not just that track record that I mentioned earlier in the show about the defensive line and the DBs and how Pat Narduzzi has a really good pedigree of finding and scouting defensive backs and scouting defensive linemen and then turning them into bona fide college football linemen. Now, obviously, when you have a unanimous All-American like Elijah Cansey, you can't replace a guy like that. You can't replace that guy's production, but you can't replace that guy's speed and technique and just the absolute force that he was on that defensive line. So what do? How do you atone for losing a guy like that? How do you atone for losing your green dot in Servassier Dennis? How do you atone for two starting safeties going to the NFL? And when I go back to the Sun Bowl, one major answer was Javon McIntyre, who came along at the final game of the regular season last year at Miami and then had a really good Sun Bowl to follow it. P.J. O'Brien was one of the stars of the spring game. He's fast as all hell, that kid. And when you have your returning cornerbacks, M.J. Devonshire and Marquez Williams, you have a really good secondary to still lean on. But, again, the questions are going to be up the middle at linebacker and then your interior defensive line by virtue of losing a guy like a Elijah Cansey. I think they are confident in the depth and what they have built on those lines. And there are a lot of younger pieces that were recruited for system fits as kind of a theme to the show here, right? With system fits and how guys fit Charlie Partridge's defensive line and how guys fit the defensive backs room that Pat Narduzzi loves to put those corners on an island. They do a pretty good job on it. But when you have Dayon Hayes now and you have your defensive interior has David Green and Devin Danielson from last year, but there are about 3 or 4 other players that could rotate on the other side of defensive end. So there's a lot of young depth at one of those positions, but there's also good experience coming back up that middle. Again, you're not going to replace Elijah Cansey. You're not going to replace Servassier Dennis with a Brandon George or a Bengali Kamara. But you have, being Pitt, has really good young depth and young depth that they feel comfortable with. And they feel like they've coached them up enough over the last year. And those players have absorbed enough from their predecessors to go in and to make plays.
We'll get into specifics because I know you've got some questions on defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've talked about the line, and just kind of looking at the two deep, I've seen a lot of seniors on that two deep. How have they been able to keep so many people happy in one area like that?
Well, again, thematic, track record, development, and just results. Pitt has led the FBS in sacks however many times it's been over the last however many years. I believe it's the last 4 or 5 years they've led the FBS in sacks. Like, the proof is there. They have these defensive linemen that they recruit that are just absolutely perfect fits for their systems. And you look at even to a Deslin Alexander, right? Amazing human off the field, but a good football player on it. He's in Jets training camp right now as an undrafted free agent, and who knows how long he sticks around in the NFL. You look at a Jalen Twyman and a Patrick Jones and a Rashad Weaver from years past, and when you're looking at Pitt, would you have seen those guys as really good NFL players right now? Like, there's proof in what Narduzzi has done. And when I say that, also, it also brings to the show that they've done a really good job of recruiting local defensive linemen. Dayon Hayes is local. Devin Danielson's local. When you look at up-and-coming guys like Sean Fitzsimmons and Elliott Donald, Like, they've done a good job recruiting Pittsburgh as well with these defensive linemen, and they're fast. They play ferocious. They know exactly technically. They have all this time to sit behind the Kalijah Kansis of the world to develop their technical skill, and then when they get into a live game, some people are, whoa, what's this? But that's what their expectation is for those up and coming defensive linemen.
Who, if I was to ask you, who was the one person on the defense that you think could be kind of that star? Who would you say? And it's any position.
I'm going MJ Devonshire, and I don't think twice about it. We know his ability as a return man, as a punt returner. We know his ability for speed. We know his ability as a press corner. He showed it in many instances last year, and he grew tremendously from the start of the season to the end of the season. And I think MJ Devonshire has a chance to be like that next underdog Pitt cornerback that might fall late in an NFL draft, and then some team picks him up, and he's just a bona fide athlete. Like, MJ Devonshire, to me, is, if you're looking at the recruiting boards, he's tabbed as an athlete because he's an athlete first and a football player second and a cornerback third. Like, this guy could play wide receiver. He could play running back. He could play safety. He could play cornerback. He's only going to play cornerback, but you know what I mean? He can return kicks. He can return punts. MJ Devonshire, I think, has a sky-high ceiling this year. And when you have a guy like Marquez Williams on the other side, who is a pretty good cornerback and I think pretty underrated himself, that's going to open up more opportunities for MJ to make plays this season. And again, you saw it with the return game last year too, and how he impacts that. So there's my pick. MJ Devonshire is like the breakout star of this defense for this year.
Just a quick move over to special teams. I feel like, when we've done these, there have been a lot of questions at the place kicker spot, but this is not one of those spots. I feel like Saul's probably one of the most automatic kickers in the league.
And he grew to become that. It took him a while to become that. Of course, he lost the job to Sam Scarton a couple of years ago, wins the job back in last year's camp, and then becomes a top 2 place kicker in the ACC, if not the best in the ACC last year. And then he kicks that, 5 for 5 in the game winner in the Sun Bowl. He had a really good year last year. He has a lot to build off of. And every time we talk to Ben Sauls, like, it doesn't become about kicking footballs. It becomes about channeling life into kicking footballs. And he talked about, a golf bag of sorts, and how, he has to have different kicks and has to have different styles of hitting the football and has to have different angles to hit the football at. Like, he knows how to break down place kicking, and it's pretty fun to hear him talk about it. But there's no questioning Ben Sauls as the place kicker. The punter is another question because, last year there's the infamous Virginia depth chart with, Cam Guess or Sam Vanderhaar or Caleb Junko. You have 2 oars at the punter position on a travel roster going to Virginia. So, like, what's Pitt going to do at punter this year? And there's new guys coming in, they're testing out. So that's kind of the big special teams question right now, is who's going to punt for him.
I mean, it's an interesting question because, we don't think about punting that much, but given the way Pitt is, a very good defensive team, having a good punter and pinning the opponent back is always a really good weapon. Jim?
Interesting on special teams there. You filled in the returner with Devonshire and punting. Who would ever imagine that would be such a problem?
I've seen Pat Narduzzi with the punters, showing him how it's done, acting like he's doing the motion and kicking and showing them how to drop. I've seen it firsthand from Pat. That's a guy that cares about special teams. The Youngstown guys care about special teams.
It is, you were talking about the kicking. That is an artiste.
Mm-hmm.
If you're pulling out all that stuff.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about this schedule here, because this is an interesting schedule. It's a mixed bag, and some of these games, like most of the ACC, can be 50-50, and let's go down some of these games. Wofford, I'm not too concerned about that one. Cincinnati is always a good. It depends on the year sometimes, but it's typically a good mix-up. And then you have West Virginia. So those 3 games. Talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, Wofford, FCS opponent, you expect Pitt to win that game. Cincinnati's interesting because they have a new quarterback coming in. They have a new head coach coming in. Like, what could Cincinnati be? Could they upset Pitt? But I'm not sure if that system's going to be, rock solid in place. Like, at West Virginia, there's so much going on with that athletic department in a general scope. And the football program hasn't been amazing either in recent memory. Now, last year's game, if that's any indication of how this could be, we're in for a treat September 16th. But I don't like rivalry stuff aside. I'm not sure how Pitt loses that. Like, I just see a stronger defense. I don't see much in West Virginia's offense. Like, Bryce Ford Wheaton was the offense last year, unless CJ Donaldson surprises us all again at running back. So I think Pitt comes out of that block right there at 3-0 to start the year.
Up next, UNC, Virginia Tech, and Louisville. Those three games.
That's, like you said, like, this is the tough stretch, one of the tough stretches. UNC, Drake May, I fully expect UNC to come into Pittsburgh and win that game. Like, as much as I would like to find reasons that Pitt's defense at this point could stop Drake May, like, I just think that UNC's offense, and I would have voted, I didn't have a vote this year because I didn't go to media day. Mm-hmm. I would have voted UNC to win the league this year. Like, I think that they have a lot of legitimate pieces. I think Drake May, when you have that quarterback that good and that good of a option and that good of a guy that can throw and run and can command an offense like that, I think your sky is the limit. And I see UNC as a real legitimate contender and a real legitimate piece to win the league. At Virginia Tech, and the key word is at. And if you look at last year's game, it was all Israel Abanikanda. That's when he broke Tony Dorsett's single-game rushing record. He had 6 touchdowns, and he was the game. None of that this year, and it's at Virginia Tech, which is always hard to win in. So that's going to be an interesting one to circle. And then Louisville beat Pitt last year. Louisville beat Pitt in Louisville, and now, new coach coming into Louisville. Like, Louisville, I think, is going to be a very competitive football program this year. And I think Louisville is going to surprise some people, like a potential top 5 team in this league. So that's going to be a really good game on October 14. Pitt could go anywhere, and I'm serious. They could go anywhere from 3-0. They could get, I think they would have to get lucky to beat UNC a little bit, but more realistically, like a 2-1 would be a good spot for them to be in after that little block right there. And then that would put them at 5-1 to begin the season after week 6.
Interesting.
Yeah, putting a lot of faith in that defense making a huge turnaround this year for UNC, but yeah. I like your confidence.
I do have faith in it. I really do. I think UNC and their offense, in college football, sometimes if you just have the offense, that can carry you at least to the conference championship, at least. And then you have a more complete team that usually shows itself later on. So I do have faith and confidence in that defense on some level.
All right, next 3 games after that at Wake Forest. It should be an interesting game. It is down at their place. Jim actually did a Wake Forest preview today, so check that out on the YouTube page. But this is an interesting team. Obviously, no Sam Hartman. A lot of turnover. Who knows what the status of Donovan Green is? He probably won't play. But the next 2 games at Notre Dame and Florida State at Acrisure, those are going to be really tough matchups.
Those are terrifying matchups to me. They're terrifying if you're a Pitt. I'm serious. Like, I think they handle Wake Forest, but you're at Notre Dame. Sam Hartman still has it, I think. I think Notre Dame beats Pitt on October 28th. And I might be a little crazy to think that Pitt has an outside shot to beat Florida State. I might be the only one that's saying that. But if they can quell Jordan Travis, if that defense can find a way to contain Jordan Travis, if that defense can find a way to just limit him enough, and then that offensive line, when you look at the tackles at Branson Taylor and Matt Gonsalves, that they can limit Jared Verse, like if you limit Florida State's top 2 options, that gives you a shot. And I think Pitt can at least give itself a shot on November 4. But I would also still say Florida State has a little too much for Pitt and wins that game. So I would take 1 and 2 with the Wake Forest win and then losses at Notre Dame and against Florida State.
a softer into the season, as of right now on paper, obviously, but should be a fun matchup. Syracuse at Yankee Stadium. The only game going on, at Yankee Stadium anytime after September this year.
Yeah.
Boston College at home. Boston College, a team that's has had its struggles the past couple of years with injuries and just not getting the production in certain spots. I think Pitt is the favorite in that game, and closing at Duke, a team was really good last year. I feel like overachieved, had some turnover luck, but that's still going to be a tricky game.
I expect them to handle Syracuse and Boston College, and the Duke game feels more like a coin flip to me than anything at this stage. I believe in Riley Leonard as a quarterback. I believe in their offensive line. I believe in what Duke could be this year. And you mentioned like last year and how that kind of trended. Maybe that was a bit of a preview of what this year is expected to be. That's how I kind of perceive Duke in a way. Like Duke to me is a very rangy, like they could finish anywhere, in my opinion, from like 4th in the ACC to about 9th. And honestly, at any of those spots, I wouldn't bat an eye. So in that final week of the season, November 25, right after Thanksgiving, down in Durham, that's going to be a good season closer. At this point, I would expect Pitt to have locked up a bowl appearance, and lack of better phrasing, that game really won't, quote unquote, matter as much, because I would expect that they would be out of the running for the top 2 spots in the ACC. But I think for, bowl pecking order and just for a little like this is a big one to go get before bowl season to get yourself some momentum. This to me feels like a coin flip game. I would pick Pitt on a glance to win it. But again, with Duke, I feel like they could be really good or really average. I just don't know what it's going to be quite yet.
So from what I'm gathering from you, you're expecting about an 8-ish win season, which is, I think, would be a pretty solid season.
Considering they're over under 6.5,
Yeah.
that, at first glance, I'm like, that is so disrespectful. Like 20 wins in 2 years, bowl game wins, AP rankings. And then you think about it and it's, well, Phil at quarterback, a lot of turnover on the defense, who's going to catch the ball. Like there's legitimate concerns to that 6.5, but also I think it makes sense in a way. So I would take Pitt in at 8 right now for entertainment purposes only. But I think Pitt is an 8-win team. What's the max number they could win? I would say about 9. And I think the minimum number they win is about 7. I think they're a 7 to 9 win team.
If gambling was legal in my state, I would probably put some money down on the over, but that's just me. But
why I said entertainment purposes only.
Yep, exactly. Let me get one more question in real quick before Jim finishes up. As we talked about recruiting before we got on, and just kind of looking over their upcoming recruiting class, and I feel like this is shaping up to be a really typical Pitt recruiting class. They have 1 4-star and a lot of guys that are going to be system guys that are going to develop.
Mm-hmm. Pat Narduzzi came out firing with this recruiting class. Like June was hot for Pitt. They pulled in a lot of kids, a lot of 3-stars, a couple of 4-stars, a couple local kids came in. At one point, they were ranked, I believe it was 8th on Rivals recruiting rankings list. And again, take it with a grain of salt, if you will. But this 24 class is rock solid, and they're pulling in more of the 4-star variety, if you will. And they are pulling in numbers. And it's not just like they're pulling in kids. They're pulling in kids that have pretty good pedigree to them when it comes to these rankings and when it comes to these, fits, so to speak. Like there are players in this next coming class that you think could slide in and be almost like, I want to say that this recruiting class is going to be able to just slide in and kind of repeat what this current group is doing. But obviously that's hard to make out. That's hard to project. But that's what Pitt believes is going to happen. They believe that they're finding players like what they have now and players that can develop into players like what they have now. So they're off to a good start with the 24 class. And like, it's a byproduct of what they were able to do in 21 and 22. Like kids are seeing that now. kids in Pennsylvania, most importantly, are seeing that now, and they're coming to Pitt to play football.
Such a rich area to recruit from too. It's so overlooked. It blows my mind how many people don't go into Pennsylvania and work some of these, some of the areas that, you just normally wouldn't even go into at all. But you should be going to some of these football games and watching some of these players. They're just incredible. Good stuff, Corey. Thank you very much for coming in and filling in some of the blanks for us and for the folks who are listening and watching. I invite everybody to make sure that you watch the interview on YouTube. You can listen to us on streaming radio and our podcast as well on ACC Nation. ACC Nation Football Preview of Pitt with our special guest, Corey Crisan, who covers Pitt and the Steelers. Check him out at DK Pittsburgh Sports.com. Thanks, Corey.
Thanks, Corey.
Thanks, guys.